And thank you for joining us as we continue our study in the book of Proverbs. And tonight we want to begin with the 12th verse of chapter 28. And in that passage we find these words: When righteous men do rejoice, there is great glory. But when the wicked rise, a man is hidden. What does he mean by that? What's the lesson that he has in mind for us here? If you look at the words that the Holy Spirit chose, some are familiar. We've seen them a number of times. And by the way, our effort is not to try to just simply go through and look at a dusty list of definitions. I realize that can be tedious. I've got a few commentaries in my library in which a fellow will be approaching a passage and he thinks he's enlightening us when he defines every word, it seems, in the book, and sometimes things that really are not particularly enlightening or useful. They were obvious enough in the English. And so you'll forgive me if we fall into that trap at times, but we don't intend to. Our purpose is to try to look at the words the Spirit chose and to put them together as intended, and to draw a practical lesson that we can apply to our lives, to our world, to our circumstances. And so in this passage we certainly find, the righteous and the wicked. We've seen those words before. One is the idea of someone who lives by a standard. They have a sense of justice. They live by an objective standard of what's lawful. The other fellow is just a man who is a criminal. He's a lawbreaker. And he says that when righteous men rejoice, there's great glory. But when the wicked rise, a man is hidden. I think in that last phrase, the word rise is particularly important for us to understand what he means, what he intends here. To rise in the sense of rising up, becoming powerful, coming on the scene. Brown, Driver, and Briggs defined the word and how it might be used. John Wesley wrote about this. He said, those who are advanced in authority. So we begin to see here the picture of wicked men rising up to positions of authority and power. And the effect that has, I think, on righteous people is that they are hidden. They tend to conceal themselves in such desperate times. Some other translations of the passage, the American Standard Version translates our text: when the righteous triumph, there is great glory. But when the wicked rise, men hide themselves. One of the modern speech translations reads, when the upright do well, there's great glory, but when evildoers are lifted up, men do not let themselves be seen, hide themselves. Again, another writes, when an honest person wins, it's time to celebrate. When crooks are in control, it's best to hide. I'm not sure that they had elections in the days of Solomon. It was a monarchy. Or in the days of the early kings of Israel, obviously a different form of government, but well, that principle sounds very relevant, doesn't it? When an honest person wins, it's time to celebrate. When crooks are in control, it's best to hide. It does picture for us a society that if it's ruled by people of principle, it's a blessing. It's a great blessing. And if it's ruled by people who are crooks, frankly, it can be a nightmare. People who are righteous in such times, when crooks are in control, make themselves scarce for fear of life and limb, as one fellow put it. Another wrote, a strong, stable government ruled by honest leaders is a wonderful blessing. Far too many people in this world labor under the tyranny of unjust rulers. Is that not true? All my life we have lived in a time, in a place where we have elections that are held, and the fellow that loses hands over freely the power to the fellow that wins. This continuation of government under one party and another, I don't know how much longer that's going to continue, but we've certainly been blessed in a way that many in the rest of the world would only dream about living in a society like that. We can see the fraying edges in our days. Nothing new about that. Over in Amos, the 5th chapter, Amos is a memorable prophet. He was not of the school of the prophets. He was a herdsman from out in the country, sent to the big city, sent to Samaria, where this is, of course, the capital of the northern kingdom when Israel was divided some years later after the time of Solomon in the days of his son. Israel and Judah became separate entities, and the northern kingdom, Israel, was always wicked, always ruled by wicked men. And Amos was sent by God to try to rattle their cage and to wake them up. And so it's quite a powerful book, the book of Amos. And in the 5th chapter of Amos, and in verse 1, we find these words, "Hear ye the word which I take up against you, even a lamentation, O house of Israel." And without going into the depth of the speech, we'll notice in verse 12 a remark that he writes here, "For I know your manifold transgressions and your mighty sins. They afflict the just, they take a bribe, they turn aside the poor in the gate from their right. Therefore the prudent shall keep silent in that time, for it's an evil time." That reminds us of our passage, doesn't it? Things get so bad, and wicked is so prevalent, that really the most prudent thing to do is just be quiet if you're a righteous person. Because this is an avalanche that's heading down a hill, and there's no way to stop it. It's going to strike the bottom, and God's judgment is all involved in this. We'll not take time to read over in Jeremiah, but 2 times in Jeremiah, he tells the prophet there, "I don't want you to pray for these people. I have determined that my temple will be destroyed. This house that was built originally to honor me," he tells Jeremiah, "you've made this into a den of thieves." The people have. And therefore don't pray for these folks, because their judgment is set. So there comes a time when even the righteous are told simply, it's of no use, of no value. It's a horrible place to be. And yet men have found themselves there at times. Mr. Bridges reminds us that the light of more than 100 prophets and even Elijah himself was hidden for a while under the tyranny of Ahab. Now, let's make this point. God worked a plan, and eventually Ahab was overthrown. And that evil house of Omri was overthrown. But there was a time when there was just simply, there was no value, frankly, in speaking out against those who had stopped listening long ago. The suffering of saints of God in the Old Testament and the New Testament, for that matter, under tyranny, under times of difficulty, times when their voice will not be heard by men, is just a reality. I always think about that when we think about Hebrews 11, listing these great heroes of faith. Toward the end of that teaching, reminds us about good people through the years who suffered tremendous trial. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in half. They were killed with swords. Some wore the skins of sheep and goats. Some were poor, abused, mistreated. The world didn't deserve these good people. Some wandered about in deserts, in mountains. They lived in caves, and they lived in holes in the ground. And so we read in our text about a righteous man in the days when wicked men arise, being hidden, being chased, being ignored, being abused. I think it's a fair point to make, and I'm not the first one to make it. But if we read this passage in Hebrews 11, and if we live long enough to see on the earth ourselves in their place, we'll know we've not been the first, or maybe the best generation of servants of God to face such judgments. So it's a reminder. If we're blessed with good rulers, let us never forget to thank God for it. And if we're cursed to live in times when the wicked rise, hang on, hold on, and recognize it's not a new thing in the earth. Let's look at verse 13. There's several passages here actually that have a similar theme. But in verse 13 we find this piece of wisdom. He that covereth his sins shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. Now, here's another practical point. It may seem rather obvious, and yet it's not obvious to everybody, because a lot of folks just simply don't practice it. Looking again at the words here, this word to cover, it's interesting, isn't it? When you read in the wisdom literature, sometimes you'll find passages that talk about a man's sin being covered. Psalm 32, blessed is the man whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. The idea there, I think, is a good one. Sometimes sin being covered is really a figure for forgiveness, for the idea of God wiping away the debt and removing the stain of sin. Well, that's a glorious thing, but it's also used at times of people who are not forgiven. They're not seeking forgiveness. They're just seeking to hide their guilt. And that's obviously the meaning here. That word conceal, same word that's used over in Genesis 37, when Joseph, in this context, has been taken by his brothers so cruelly. He has been held against his will, and eventually will be sold into slavery. In fact, it was his brother Judah who made the point. He said, what's the good if we kill our brother? That's what they thought about doing. Why don't we sell him, and instead of concealing his blood, we'll get some money out of him that way. To conceal the blood. There's the imagery there of murder concealed, hidden, not repented of. In fact, in that passage we were alluding to a moment ago in Psalm 32, David rejoices because he has been forgiven and did not hide his sin in the sense of trying to deny it. Well, he did for a while, but he confessed his guilt. Blessed is the man, verse 2 of Psalm 32, whom the Lord imputeth not iniquity, in whose spirit there is no guile. When I kept silence, my bones waxed old through my roaring all the day long. Night and day thy hand was upon me, my moisture is turned to the drought of summer. I acknowledged my sin unto thee, and mine iniquity have I not hid. I said, I will confess my transgressions unto the Lord, and thou forgavest the iniquity of my sin. It's a great definition, I think, of what it means to hide sin. It's the opposite of confessing our transgressions, of acknowledging our sin. Here's a fellow that won't confess his sin. He hides it. He won't forsake his sin. He continues in it. Well, he's not going to prosper. But the fellow who does submit to God, who does confess his sin and turns away from it, he'll be blessed. That's what wisdom teaches. Matthew Henry, writing about this, talks about the folly of indulging sin, of excusing it, denying it, extenuating it, diminishing it, dissembling it, throwing the blame on other people. It seems to me like that's a lot more popular course in our world, isn't it? You may work in a workplace. When's the last time you heard somebody, when there's a big foul up, say, "This was all my fault. This is what I did, and this is what I should have done, and this is on me"? Well, maybe that happens regularly where you work. Good for you. And I tell you, there are people that bend over backwards if they're caught on videotape doing something. They'll act like they didn't. There are people who think that the way to deal with any failure on their part is stonewall it, deny it, ignore it, look for a scapegoat. The Lord says you can do that, but ultimately that's not going to bless you. You're going to have to pay for that. You may get away with it today, but your day's coming. A hypocrite, Brother Harkrider said, wants to acknowledge his guilt. Never wants to acknowledge his guilt. So he tries to cover his sin. Actually, he only makes matters worse. Repentance and confession not only secures forgiveness, but it relieves the conscience. But there are people who eventually wind up with a burnt-out conscience, and they're a burnt-out human being if they've spent their whole life trying to dodge responsibility for themselves. Too much of that goes on, and it makes miserable people, and it makes others miserable and suffer as well. I like what Mr. Rawlinson wrote. He said that, or Mr. Dean, I think it was, wrote the pulpit commentary. He said, confession alone without amendment does not win pardon and mercy. Notice that. Confession without amendment. In other words, if you don't make a change, if you just say, well, I was wrong, but you don't change, then there's no glory in that either. There has to be both. That's the proverb commends both confession and change. It is when the sinner acknowledges his transgression, turns from it to newness of life, that God heals his backsliding, turns away his anger, renews his tokens of love. Confession is made to God, against whom all sin is committed, and to man if one has transgressed against him. If nobody else knows about my wrong, God knows. And ultimately, all sin goes back to our wronging him. The greatest evil that I do when I commit sin is against God. We're going to look at this in a moment, I think. But over in Psalm 51, we've looked at this before, but this is one of the great penitential psalms, a famous Psalm of David. We've heard it many times. In Psalm 51, it's a plea for mercy. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according to the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgression. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity. Cleanse me from my sin. Let me pause to say, you remember the setting here. In fact, it's given to us in the title of this psalm, a psalm of David when Nathan the prophet came unto him after he had gone in to Bathsheba. Not only had he committed adultery with the wife of one of his most devoted servants, but to try to cover that, he had gotten that servant drunk, and then eventually, when the man didn't fall for his deception, had him killed in battle, murdered, really. Had the captain of the army pull back from him and allow him to be taken by the enemy, just murdered. Horrible, terrible, a deep, wicked stain. And David, rightly so, is ashamed, and he talks about pleading to God for mercy. Wash me, cleanse me. Verse 3 now of Psalm 51 reads, For I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. And then he says something that might seem at first rather startling. He writes, Against thee only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight. And we might look at that and we might think, what do you mean you've just done evil to God? What do you think you did to Uriah, your servant? A man who you stole his wife from, and then you murdered him? Don't you think he deserves a mention? Well, of course he did. David is not just evil of sin, is that we violate the will of God. And that's, I think, what Mr. Dean has talked about in this comment from the pulpit commentaries. Confession is made to God, against whom all sin is committed. And it's not until a fellow understands the weight of it. You know, if he's just trying to say words to get by, or what do I need to tell you so you'll get off my back, and I'm going to go back to the same thing, that has nothing to do with the behavior that leads to blessing here. He says the really wise fellow is the fellow who understands the marriage between confession and repentance that leads to a better life now, and certainly leads to a happier visit with God in the judgment. I'll tell you something else that ought to impress us about our text here. And that is, isn't it a glorious thing that God is willing to forgive? He that covers his sins shall not prosper, but whoever confesses and forsakes them will have mercy. What do you think God's got to gain from showing me mercy? You ever thought about that question? I'm sure you have. It is a good question. Do I go to God and I say, Lord, now you owe me forgiveness? He promised he would forgive us, and he'll fulfill his promise. But he's not benefited by forgiving me. Forgiveness is not, I don't do God a favor by receiving forgiveness. God does me a favor. That's what mercy is. It's grace. It's favor. Unmerited by definition. Bestowed upon us. Isn't it a great thing that God is willing to forgive? And as one fellow put it, would it be that the people of God were half as faithful in showing mercy as God is? They better all be faithful in showing mercy as God does, because the Lord warned us twice in the Sermon on the Mount that those who show no forgiveness get no forgiveness. And that puts a little sting in it for me. You know, I can be hard-hearted, or I can be harsh, but the Lord has been merciful, and if I don't learn that lesson from him, it'll be to my own shame and destruction. Well, let's look at another, if we might, of the Proverbs, this time the 14th verse of Proverbs 28. Happy is the man that feareth always, but he that hardeneth his heart shall fall into mischief. Happy is the man that fears always. Fears what? Fears whom? Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? First of all, the idea of fear, variety of uses as you'd expect, including the idea of alarm, of awe, dread. The verb occurs in poetry. Those who worship and trust God have no need to dread, but those who break the law do. Sinners in Zion do. Worshippers of idols do. They all have reason to fear. Well, look at how this passage is translated in different translations. In the English Standard Version, blessed is the one who fears the Lord always, but whoever hardens his heart will fall into calamity. Blessed is the one who is always fearful of sin, but whoever is hard-hearted will fall into disaster. And then back in the old King James, happy is the man that feareth, with no object given in that passage. As far as I know, there's not one in the passage. It has to be understood. And yet one translation tells us that the passage commends fearing the Lord, and the other fearing sin. And yet, are those two really that different when you think about it? I think that they're different ways of saying the same thing. There's a reverence for God, and the flip side of that same coin is going to be a fear of displeasing God. If we reverence God, then we're going to be terrified and ashamed and horrified by the idea of letting him down. And so this great old proverb teaches us an important lesson, that godly people in this sense live in fear. I don't mean that they live cowering in the corner. I don't mean that they live in timidity. I don't mean that they live in the scriptures don't teach that we live in a faithless stance toward the promises of God. But godly people are reverent people and fearful in this sense. Matthew Henry said a long time ago, he said, there's a benefit in holy caution. That's a great expression. It sounds strangely, but it's very true. He said, happy is the man that fears always. Most people think that those are happy who never fear. But there is a fear which is so far from having torment in it that it has the greatest satisfaction. Happy is the man who always keeps up in his mind a holy awe and a reverence of God. His holy, His glory, God's goodness, God's government. Who's always afraid of offending God and incurring His displeasure. Who keeps conscience tender and has a dread of the appearance of evil. I think it was William Barclay who made a similar comment in one of his works. He talked about living in a state of holy tension. We live in joy. That's true. It's a joy to be a Christian. But there's also that aspect of dread and awe and fear, to think that we might just take the wheel and turn over here off the road and into the ditch and down the embankment. You know, God forbid that we make choices like that or go in that direction. That kind of behavior is always held in dread. Because we love God, we hate to displease Him. One fellow put it this way. He said, one's prospects in this life depend on reverential fear. And I think that's true. Everyone that blesses, the Lord blesses everyone, I should say, who is afraid to do evil. And so that is. The second part of this verse, talking about this holy reverence and fear of displeasing God, is the fellow that hardens his heart. He hardens his heart against God and the things of God. We know exactly what that looks like. We see it all around us. Turn on the television for 10 minutes. And you'll find somebody on there, some arrogant, smart aleck, who thinks he's smarter than God, who looks down on anything that has a whiff of obedience or submission or reverence. That kind of spirit's alive and well, and is promoted to us as being the superior way. A lot of young people get caught up in that spirit. Mr. Toy described it as somebody who braces himself in his own doings and does not dread sin. Sin is a joke to these people. They have no fear of sin. If it feels good, do it. If it's something that you want to do, then just jump and don't worry about where you land. Such folks are to be pitied, not to be imitated, not to be praised. They're to be pitied because they're heading for disaster. I like what Mr. Smith wrote. He said that such a man scoffs at fear and disregards the thought of God's punishment. Such a one scorns the grace of God. He must ultimately experience evil, just as surely as night follows day. Divine judgment eventually will come. In that passage in Hebrews chapter 10 that we've read so many times, what do you think a man is worthy of, who's trodden underfoot the Son of God and counted the thing that God holds as most holy to be something common? What kind of punishment will come to a man that rejects God's own Son? As the Lord reminds us, their vengeance is mine. Excuse me, I will repay, says the Lord. So, folks with hard hearts, still plenty of them around. And it's sad, it's terrible. And it seems that if there's any honesty in people like that, our job is to try to show a better way and share the good news of the grace of God. As we said earlier, there are different ways to cover your sin. You can act like it doesn't exist. You can lie about it. or you can confess it and find forgiveness for it. Boy, that's so much better life, now and later. And that's really what the Proverbs remind us of in this passage. Let's look at another, if we might, the Proverbs. This time we'll take 15 and 16 together. As a roaring lion and a raging bear, a ranging bear, so is a wicked ruler over the poor people. The prince that wanteth understanding is also a great oppressor, but he that hates covetousness will prolong his days. Both these passages bring us back to the idea of a ruler. And in the first of these passages, he talks about rulers that he says are more like animals. Like a roaring lion or a charging bear, so is a wicked ruler over a poor people. Another paraphrase reads, poor people are helpless against a wicked ruler. He is as dangerous as a growling lion or a prowling bear. We go to the zoo and we see these full-grown beasts, lion, for example. If you're like me, you're thinking, boy, I sure am glad I'm not down there with that with that rascal. Looks okay from here, pretty magnificent creature, but I wouldn't want to catch him out here in the woods somewhere, especially when he was hungry. And there is a ferocity that certain men have. A rapacity and cruelty of such beasts well represents some wicked men. David, again going back to the Psalms, in Psalm 7, we think about King David, but we also know David's story, and we know that for a number of years before he became king, he was David the fugitive. He had a lot of people that were jealous of him, and they were in Saul's ear, and Saul sometimes didn't need much encouragement to the wrong direction, but David had a lot of enemies in the court who were stoking the fire of Saul's bitterness and jealousy. So David writes about that time period and about those that were trying really to put an end to his life. It's another Psalm of David, as the title tells us. But in this psalm he begins, O Lord my God, in thee do I put my trust. Save me from all them that persecute me, and deliver me, lest he tear my soul like a lion, rending it in pieces, while there is none to deliver. David saw himself as facing enemies that were very much like wild animals, like lions, as ferocious and as dangerous as a lion out of the wild. I certainly would not be silly enough to argue with the Holy Spirit in these comparisons. They are numerous, really, in the Scriptures. But when you stop and think about it, the people he's comparing these animals to really are worse than the animals. In other words, I don't think that animals are capable of malice. If a lion tears a man in two and eats him, it's because he's hungry. A bear that might charge an individual out there a lot of times thinks he's protecting himself or his cubs, or her cubs, as it were. But the idea of men acting in such a ruthless fashion is really below the behavior of animals. It is as ferocious as, but really in many ways worse than, what a wild beast would do. And there are plenty of folks like that. He contrasts this with poor people. Poor people, that is, weak, resourceless, to such powerful tyrants. They have no chance any more than a human being out here just by himself is going to be able to match strength with a lion or with a bear, not even having a weapon in his hand. There are people who are as cruel and as ferocious as any animal would be, and more malicious. And such people have done their damage all through the years. He couples with that warning about these types of rulers a note here about senseless rulers. A prince, this is verse 16, that wanteth understanding is also a great oppressor. But he that hates covetousness shall prolong his days. He couples together here the idea of an evil ruler, an oppressive ruler, with a senseless ruler. What does he mean by that? And what is the connection? The word here for senseless is someone who is void of understanding, skill, reason, wisdom. The prince who has no sense is a cruel ruler. But he who has no desire to get profit for himself will have a long life. And a ruler without good sense is a cruel tyrant. He who hates dishonesty will rule for a long time. It's obvious that he's making a connection here between a senselessness, a lack of wisdom, greed, and all the tyranny that will bring, and the self-destruction it'll bring to him. Clark offers this explanation of the connection there. He says a weak prince, unskilled, unwise, usually because he's not wise, will pick the wrong people to be around him, people that will flatter him, people that won't help him do the right thing but help him in the wrong way. They'll all be busy trying to fleece everybody they can and stuff their pockets. He'll plunge people into expensive wars, burden people with taxes for efforts that are really selfish and not selfless in their outlook. That prince who lacks understanding will wind up in the company of the greedy and of the oppressive and of the tyrannical. Again, there's never been a shortage of rulers like that. It's an old story. Matthew Henry reminds us of how that in Moses' day, when Moses looked for those who would be judges over Israel and rulers in the land, he said they had to be people who hated covetousness. Moses' character of good magistrates was men who feared God, hated covetousness. Not only being covetous, but they hated it, period. The kind of people that would, and this is a phrase we find in the scriptures, in Isaiah, for example, they'd shake the hand when it came to bribes. What's the idea there? Not shaking hands in agreement, but the idea, if you try to get the picture here of somebody trying to put some money in the palm of your hand, he'd shake his hand. I don't want that. You can't buy me. I'm not for sale. Those are the kinds of people that Moses said we need ruling in Israel. Need them ruling everywhere. A ruler that's covetous, Mr. Henry continues, will neither do justly nor love mercy, but the people under him shall be bought and sold. And how true that is. It is the saddest kind of situation when people find themselves governed by those who look to those under their charge as just being commodities to buy and sell, just cattle, no real interest in the individual. Every form of government in the world, I guess, it has its flaws, but those governments through the years that have been set up on the idea that the state rules and that the people serve the state, those have always been the most oppressive and the most misery-producing states. People think how wonderful it is to have the state take care of them. They'll take care of them all right. And there's nothing new about that. This passage takes us back to this idea. A ruler without good sense will be a cruel tyrant, but one who hates dishonesty will rule for a long time. Somebody might say that it looks like that some of the folks who have loved covetousness have been able to hold their seat for quite a while. And I understand the point. I certainly do. We have seen in our country, and again, I'm sure it's worse in other places. But sometimes, again, this is not to be political, but just we're dealing with proverbs that look to human government and rulers and subjects, and so I think it's not inappropriate to make this comment in passing. It's always been a mystery to me how somebody might be in public service for, I don't know, 30 years, 40 years. And they went into this job and they barely had enough money to find an apartment in Washington. And by the time they leave, they've got tens of millions of dollars. And I know it might be a rather silly question, but I just wonder where all that money came from. Uh, you reckon it was from their salary? You reckon they just saved their pennies and just shook that jar out on the bed and rolled them up, and took them down to the bank? Lo and behold, we found $40 million in pennies here. We surely have been good savers. Folks in all parties and all directions that have sold their influence, that have done dirty deals, and that have ingratiated themselves to enrich themselves, and have sold out the trust that's been placed in them. This is not a new story. It's not an American story. It's a human story. And if we think that we have troubles in our system, and I'm sure we do, it wasn't any better in Eastern monarchies 3,000 years ago, I'll tell you that. But wherever it's found, here's a message that I do believe, and it's a point the Proverbs make regularly, and that is that ultimately, I don't care how high and mighty you are, and how many years you might think you get away with it, God is going to call you into answer for what you do. All of us, from the highest to the lowest, we all are going to have to answer to God. And there are a lot of folks who live as if that's not going to happen. They're going to find out how wrong they are. Well, we've been out of time. I certainly appreciate your interest and your listening today, and I hope that these reminders in the Proverbs, I hope you find them as relevant as they seem to me to be every time I read them. Let me again offer to you, if you have a question about something that we've said, or maybe you think we've misunderstood a passage, or you have a particular point to make, feel free to get that note to me, and we'll deal with it here on this broadcast, and try to deal with your question or your point. But I do very much thank you for your kind attention and your interest in this, and we look forward to being with you again in the